fuck a bookmark on this. Hold on a minute. So when you say something like that and you're like, oh yeah, no, 100%, there were 1952, there were UFOs in DC and whatever, and then people hear something about Eisenhower, I'm just thinking of like all the most cynical people out there who are like, what the fuck am I even listening to right now? Let's start with the 52 thing.
Yes.
You're saying that we had witnesses on the ground in DC. Did you say they were all government related, or were there also civilians? Let's start.
Well, there were civilians too, but they were government related, like pilots and radar operators and Al Chop. I think he was like public relations between UFO. You have to look him up, Al Chop. But Al Chop was in the radar room in 1952 when they scrambled military jets that were doing roughly 500 miles an hour through the pitch black.
But these UFOs allegedly do like 12,000 miles an hour or something.
Well, my point is this. The pilot was terrified. He was flying in pitch black, 500 miles an hour over the Capitol.
And how many had they sighted again? You said so much in there. I want to make sure we're following.
5 to 12 UFOs. I don't know how
big
many.
Are we talking?
They were not, they were like, remember they described the Tic Tac?
Yeah.
They were in that ballpark size, and they were surrounding his craft, flying at 500 miles an hour. They were just, they were, appear over here, appear over there. And at first, there was 2 consecutive weekends in July of 1952. Anyone can Google it. And at first, these UFOs would appear, they'd scramble the jets, and then as soon as the jets got anywhere near them, they were gone. They're just poof, gone. But at one point, the military jet, the pilot, went after him, and they surrounded his plane. And Al Chop was in the room, and we have testimony on camera for the first time ever, because it was part of an archive. This guy went around with a camera and documented all these historical cases. Thank God. But he never did anything. He never did anything with it. Tom Julian and Project Archive, and I had read about this Project Archive, and I was like, oh my God, footage of Al Chop, footage of this other person. This is unheard of. Nobody's got any of this stuff. And reached out to him, and he's like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. That's just some weird rumor on the internet. I don't have any of that stuff. And I was like, that's kind of weird. So then I was like, well, I'm working with Jacques Vallée. And he's like, you're working with Jacques Vallée?
I have the footage.
I have the footage. He goes, yeah, I swear to God.
As a matter of fact, I do.
Yeah, I was like, so can you get me dinner with Jacques Vallée? I said, I'll fly you out, and we'll get together. And so I did. I flew him out, Tom Julian. We had dinner, and he goes, I'll tell you what, I'll make a couple of people. I've got this big archive, but honestly, I've got these other plans for it. I need to actually remember that, because that guy's sitting on some crazy stuff. And I'll make a couple of select interviews from my catalog available to you. And one of them was Al Chop. And Al Chop describes, because the first time ever in the 1952 case over Washington, D.C., where you have a witness that was in the radar room and heard the pilot of the military jet, heard his voice, saw the radar, saw his jet and all the UFOs around it, and listened to the pilot's voice, who was terrified. What do I do? What do I do? They all just stood there in shock. They didn't know what to tell him to do.
We sure this wasn't like the Nazis and they just figured some shit out there in World War II and they were left over?
So here's the thing.
I got to throw it out there.
But here's my point again, because I'm going to get back to obfuscation, okay? So what happens? Very compelling testimony, military pilots, radar confirmation, visual confirmation, air-to-air radar, air-to-ground radar, ground-to-air radar, all this stuff. Really good case. Of course, none of that made it in Project Blue Book, but that's another story. So what happens? They got to do something. It's making headline news. Google it. Anyone can Google UFOs over Washington, 1952.
It's behind you.
Yeah.
On Wikipedia there.
Yeah. There we go. So they form the military. The CIA gets involved. They get a panel called the Robertson Panel, intellectual heavyweights, think tank kind of thing. And they get together. I don't know it was, a couple of weeks. We got to figure this problem out. This is a problem, right? We don't have control over airspace. We don't have explanation. They had a it was the biggest news conference with General John Samford since the ending of World War II. It was 1952. I don't know. They probably did that in July as well. You can look that one up. General John Samford gives a press like addresses the nation in uniform, a general, basically saying, hey, we got these objects, could be weather phenomenon, or there are these things that we just can't explain coming from very credible people. And, you know, it's a big statement from a
Huge.
military general in 1952. It's like, wow. So they got this problem. So the CIA gets involved. They get the Robertson panel, 1953, early on in 1953. And ultimately what they say is, well, you know, lying to the public, so many testimonies. All right, tell you what we're going to do. We're going to adopt this policy of ridicule. And that's pretty much how this story has remained covered up for all these years, because ridicule, and it was a policy that was adopted in 1953 by the Robertson panel, and it stuck.
How very CIA of them.
Yeah, and so that's obfuscation. Like, that's just throw in a bunch of ridicule and jokes and laughs. Like, if you think about a military pilot being surrounded by UFOs, being, you know, seen visually, picked up on radar, all that stuff, gun cam footage, you know, there's nothing really funny about that.
Yeah,
that's pretty intense. But you have the ridicule factor,
do.
so now you got this knee-jerk reaction. Anytime UFOs are mentioned, it's giggle factor, right? And that's a very effective campaign, and that started in 53.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. Please hit that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.